Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about the structure function of the pineal gland, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland. And as you can see here, we're going to start here with the pineal gland. Now the pineal gland is found within the brain in an area called the epithalamus, which is near the third ventricle deep within the brain. The pineal gland is made of, in part, by specialized cell types called pinealocytes, which secrete a hormone known as melatonin. Now, melatonin is derived from serotonin, which is derived from tryptophan. And the effects of melatonin on the body are varied, and scientists believe that melatonin may affect things such as timing of sexual maturity and puberty. It may also help coordinate day and night cycles, so that some scientists believe or have found evidence to support that melatonin is involved with your sleep-wake cycle, so such as like your day and night cycles, like knowing when to sleep and knowing when to wake up. It's also believed that melatonin also affects other physiological processes such as body temperature, sleep, and appetite. And it's interesting that melatonin also leads to the production of antioxidant and detoxification molecules in some cells in your body. Now, the pituitary gland you're going to find connected to the hypothalamus. So you may remember that the pituitary gland sits within a space called the hypophyseal fossa, which is a little indentation in the sphenoid bone of the skull. The pituitary gland is this nodule that hangs off the base of the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland can actually be divided into two major lobes. So we'll talk about the pituitary gland as having a posterior portion and an anterior portion. So we'll have a posterior pituitary lobe and an anterior pituitary lobe. Now the posterior pituitary is also called the neurohypophysis. The reason being is that the posterior portion of the pituitary gland is actually made of neural tissue or nervous tissue. And I'll show you guys a picture of this here in a couple slides. That gives the name neurohypophysis, posterior pituitary, because it's made of also neural tissue. The anterior pituitary, it's called the Adeno Hypothesis because adeno is the root for gland. In fact, the anterior pituitary is actually made of glandular tissue. So the actual endocrine cells will be in the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. Now, what we're seeing here is a picture of the relationship of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You can see here that the pituitary gland hangs off the base of the hypothalamus. In fact, they're connected by a narrow stalk, also called the infundibulum. Now, with the pituitary gland, we see there's an anterior portion as well as a posterior portion. Now, with this first slide, what it's showing is some more detail on the structure of the posterior pituitary gland. Now, what's unique about the posterior pituitary gland is that the neurons that release hormones for the posterior pituitary gland, those neurons have their cell bodies in the hypothalamus. In fact, the neuron cell bodies form specific nuclei or collections of cell bodies in the hypothalamus called the paraventricular nucleus as well as the supraoptic nucleus. Now, the paraventricular nucleus releases mostly oxytocin, so that the neurons in the paraventricular nucleus make oxytocin, that's the hormone, and that the neurons in the supraoptic nucleus mostly make ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin. Now, the way that these hormones actually get released by these neurons is that these neurons have axons that continue down through the infundibulum, and those axons will reach the posterior pituitary gland, and those axons will actually form synapses with a capillary bed here in the posterior pituitary gland. Now, capillary bed is the smallest of your blood vessels, and you're going to have a lot of capillary beds here in the posterior pituitary gland, so that the terminal bouton or axon terminals here for each of these neurons, they're going to release vesicles containing their respective hormones. so that the neurons here in the supraoptic nucleus, they're going to create antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. That's going to be packaged into vesicles, which then will get released at the axon terminals, and then that hormone will then enter the interstitial fluid of the posterior pituitary gland, where that hormone then can diffuse into the blood vessels of your posterior pituitary, and then eventually diffuse to the rest of your bloodstream. Now, the key point here is that the posterior pituitary gland is only involved with two major hormones. That's oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And we'll go into the effects of those hormones in a little bit. Now, oxytocin, released by the posterior pituitary gland, it's going to be stimulated by suckling of the breast tissue, stretch of uterine tissue as well. Now, ultimately what happens is that oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions and helps initiate labor. So that stretch of the uterus leads to the release of oxytocin by the posterior pituitary gland, which then goes on and actually stimulates uterine contractions. Now, what's interesting about oxytocin is it also helps initiate milk ejection from breast tissue. So that lactation involves this hormone, oxytocin. Now, what's not on the slide, and just sort of an interesting side note, is that oxytocin is also important in forming friendships and close relationships. So they call this the pair bonding hormone, because when you're forming close relationships and friendships, you actually release a lot of oxytocin. Now, another hormone released by the posterior pituitary gland is called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. It's also called vasopressin. Now, this is a peptide hormone that's synthesized by the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and that when this antidiuretic hormone gets released into the capillary beds of your posterior pituitary gland, it's going to enter your bloodstream, where eventually this antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, will travel to the kidneys. Now, ultimately, what antidiuretic hormone does is it prevents diuresis, hence the name antidiuretic hormone. So it prevents diuresis. Now, diuresis is water loss. So antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that actually prevents water loss in the kidneys. And the way you prevent water loss in the kidneys is to reabsorb more water back into your bloodstream from your kidneys, so that you don't form as much urine. So the function of antidiuretic hormone is it helps you conserve your water, and it's also going to decrease your urine output. So you can imagine then how antidiuretic hormone might be stimulated, where if you're dehydrated, you're going to release a lot of antidiuretic hormone, and that's going to help prevent loss of water. And you're also going to see this associated with things like low blood pressure. And when we get to the cardiovascular system, we'll talk more about how this specifically works. Now, what we're looking at here is the anterior pituitary gland in more detail, where the structures of the posterior pituitary gland have been kind of grayed out. And what's highlighted now is the structure of the anterior pituitary gland. Now, it turns out that the anterior pituitary gland, also called the Adeno Hypothesis, has a lot of endocrine cells here within the anterior portion of the pituitary itself. Now, these endocrine cells release hormones, but the way that these endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary gland get activated is by hormones released by the hypothalamus. So there are specialized neurons in the hypothalamus that will release what are called releasing hormones. So we'll have GHRH, which is growth hormone releasing hormone. We'll have TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone. We'll have CRH, which is corticotropic releasing hormone. GnRH, which is gonadotropic releasing hormone. And PIH, which is prolactin inhibitory hormone. And we'll talk more about that. Now, these neurons that release the releasing hormones, they're going to release those hormones into the capillary bed here in the infundibulum, and those releasing hormones from the hypothalamus will travel through the blood vessels here to the anterior pituitary gland, where they can diffuse out into the interstitial fluid or extracellular fluid of the anterior pituitary gland, and that those releasing hormones then can stimulate the release of hormones by endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary gland. So what we'll have then is that the hypothalamus will release hormones like growth hormone releasing hormone. That growth hormone releasing hormone will then get exocytosed into a blood vessel here, or capillary bed. That growth hormone releasing hormone then can travel to the anterior pituitary gland, where it then can stimulate cells that release growth hormone. So that growth hormone is released directly from the anterior pituitary gland. And the rest of these hormones, like TSH, ACTH, FSH, and so on, those are going to be stimulated by these other releasing hormones. So this is the first example of our hormonal stimulus we talked about, where hormones released by a particular endocrine structure can lead to the release of other hormones by another endocrine gland. Now what happens is that the anterior pituitary gland will release a couple or several key hormones here, such as growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. And we'll go into more detail on the effects of these specific hormones soon. Now, the effects of growth hormone are broad. Now, growth hormone is going to be triggered by low blood levels of growth hormone, as well as other secondary triggers such as hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar, as well as increases in amino acid content and low levels of fatty acids, as well as exercise. Now what happens is that the main effects of growth hormone is that it's going to cause liver tissue, muscle tissue, bone, cartilage, and other tissues to stimulate somatic growth. So that growth hormone will stimulate the growth of cells in those tissues. So that growth hormone will stimulate the liver, skeletal muscle, bone, cartilage, and other tissues to increase in number. So somatic growth. And so in that sense, it's an anabolic hormone. Now if you guys remember, going back to chapter 2, we talked about metabolism, and one of the forms of metabolism was anabolism, where anabolic reactions build up molecules. So if you're building up molecules, you're going to make larger and larger tissues. So that the effect of growth hormone is it causes things like your musculoskeletal system to get much larger. Now what we see here is a more detailed mechanism outlining the process of growth hormone stimulation. Now what we see then is that the hypothalamus will secrete growth hormone releasing hormone, which then will cause the anterior pituitary gland to release growth hormone. Now, growth hormone will have two different actions. It'll have indirect actions and direct actions. Now, the indirect actions are the ones that are growth promoting, so that the indirect actions will then cause direct growth of skeletal and extraskeletal tissues through the use of insulin-like growth factors, so that growth hormone will cause liver and other tissues to release these IGFs, or insulin-like growth factors, which then directly cause skeletal and extraskeletal tissues to increase in size and number. And so then in diseases where growth hormone is secreted in excess, you're going to see lots of skeletal tissue growth. So you're going to see overgrowth of the skeleton. And you're also going to see overgrowth of other extraskeletal tissues, such as skeletal muscle. Now, it's also going to cause the mobilization or increase in growth of cartilage and cell growth and proliferation of other tissues as well. Now, some of the direct actions of growth hormone is they're going to cause an increase in fatty acid metabolism, so that we're going to see a breakdown of fatty acids and a release of fatty acids in the bloodstream in response to growth hormone. Now, if you remember back to the previous slide, one of the ways that growth hormone was stimulated to be released was by low fatty acid levels in the bloodstream. Okay? So if you have low fatty acid levels, you can release growth hormone, which then causes fatty acids to be broken down and released into your bloodstream, which then can be used by other tissues which could be growing, such as skeletal and extraskeletal tissues. They can use these excess fatty acids to increase or use that energy to help power those cells. Now, one of the other direct effects of growth hormone is carbohydrate metabolism, where then we can increase our blood glucose concentration as well as have other anti-insulin effects. Now, we'll talk about insulin in the next video, or several videos from now. And so that the effect of insulin is that it decreases blood glucose levels, but here what we have is growth hormone. It's going to oppose the effects of insulin and therefore increase blood glucose levels. So what you'd expect to see in response to growth hormone is an increase in fatty acid content in your blood, as well as an increase in blood glucose levels. Now, both of these are energy-carrying molecules. Fatty acids and glucose can help supply energy for your cells to basically, undergo metabolic activities, such as increasing cartilage formation and skeletal growth, as you can see here with the indirect actions. Now, if you look up here, what we see is that there are some feedback mechanisms that prevent growth hormone from getting too high in concentration. Now, what these dotted lines show are negative feedback mechanisms, which then go on to inhibit the additional release of hormones such as growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone directly. So we saw that in response to growth hormone, the liver and other tissues can release insulin-like growth factors. These IGFs not only stimulate skeletal and cartilage growth, but these IGFs can also feed back on the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone release. That way, you can prevent the release of growth hormone, and that is a negative feedback mechanism which keeps growth hormone levels at a homeostatic level. In fact, the presence of growth hormone can actually inhibit additional growth hormone release. And again, that's a negative feedback mechanism that helps maintain homeostasis. So what we see here is an example of growth hormone kind of gone awry. Now, this is going to be a disorder of pituitary growth hormone. This could be the gigantism, where under certain pituitary diseases, such as a pituitary tumor, you can release excess growth hormone. Now, excessive growth hormone can lead to the overgrowth of skeletal and cartilage tissues, like bone and cartilage. And ultimately what that leads to is a condition known as gigantism. So this is dating back to the early 20th century, where this at the time was the tallest man of the world, and he's standing next to, at the time, who was the shortest man in the world. At least that was known at the time. And so this is gigantism, which is going to be due to an overabundance of growth hormone. Now, some of the other hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland include thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, as well as follicle-stimulating hormone. Now, thyroid-stimulating hormone, released by the anterior pituitary gland, it stimulates the thyroid gland. Now, if you remember from our introductory video to the endocrine system, we talked about how the thyroid gland is a gland that sits on the anterior and inferior side of your neck. Now, the way that thyroid hormone is actually released by the thyroid gland is it's stimulated by thyroid-stimulating hormone, and that's released by the anterior pituitary gland. Well, it turns out that the cells that release TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone, those are stimulated by TRH, which is thyroid-releasing hormone, which was released by the hypothalamus. And that's that whole hypothalamic pituitary mechanism, which ultimately leads to the release of terminal hormones like thyroid hormone. That's going to be the last hormone in the chain. Now, we'll go into more detail about the effects of thyroid hormone in the next video. Another hormone released by the anterior pituitary gland is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this particular hormone causes the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. So it's going to promote the release of hormones from the outermost layer of the adrenal gland, called the adrenal cortex, It's going to promote the release of things such as glucocorticoids and androgens, as well as things called mineralocorticoids. Now we'll go into more detail on these specific hormones in the next video. Just for now, it's important to note that adrenocorticotropic hormone is released by the anterior pituitary gland, and it stimulates the adrenal glands to release various hormones. Another hormone released by the anterior pituitary gland is follicle stimulating hormone, also called FSH. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the gonads, such as the ovaries and testes. In fact, this is going to cause development of sex cells, such as eggs in the ova and sperm in the testes, so that sperm and egg development are promoted by follicle stimulating hormone. Later on in the semester, we'll go into more detail on the specific mechanism when we talk about the reproductive system. Just for now, it's important to note that follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of sex cells, such as ova or eggs in the ovary and sperm cells in the testes. Now, two other hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland include luteinizing hormone as well as prolactin. Now, luteinizing hormone, also denoted as LH, stimulates the release of other sex hormones by the ovaries and testes. In fact, luteinizing hormone leads to the production of estrogen and progesterone in the ovaries, and it also causes the release of testosterone in males by the testes. So LH, or luteinizing hormone, the same hormone can stimulate different hormones to be released from different gonads, such as the ovaries and testes. Now, prolactin is another hormone released by the anterior pituitary gland, and as the name sounds, prolactin stimulates secretion of lactation, or breast milk. So that prolactin helps promote lactation, or milk letdown. Now, what's interesting about prolactin is that it's going to be stimulated by things such as estrogen and breastfeeding, so that nipple stimulation actually will help stimulate the release of prolactin, which then ultimately helps promote lactation. So it's pretty neat.